Ok, bienvenidas, bienvenidos sean todos a esta sexta sesión del Seminario Permanente de Estudios Canadienses, SPEC, que continúa en modalidad virtual, pero les adelantamos que la siguiente sesión de octubre ya será híbrida en nuestras instalaciones del CISAN mediante la plataforma Zoom por YouTube. Y para quienes no puedan acompañarnos físicamente en Ciudad Universitaria en la Ciudad de México, welcome everybody to this sixth session of the Permanent Seminar of Canadian Studies, SPEC, which continues in virtual mode, but I can tell you in advance that the next session in October will already be hybrid at our CISAN facilities and through the Zoom and YouTube platform for those who cannot be with us in Ciudad Universitaria in Mexico City. Primero, quiero agradecer a mis colegas de St. Mary's University por compartir sus investigaciones con nosotros el día de hoy, y en particular al doctor Gavin Friedel, académico, investigador y director del programa de estudios en desarrollo global de St. Mary's University, y que ha sido mi colega huésped durante mi estancia sabática, ayudándome a sentirme realmente en casa durante esta aventura. Muchas gracias, Gavin. First, I want to thank my colleagues at St. Mary's University for sharing this research with us today, and in particular, Dr. Gavin Friedel, an academic researcher and chair of St. Mary's University Global Development Studies Program, who has been my fellow guest during my sabbatical, helping me at all times and making me feel home, like I'm home during this adventure. Thank you very much, Gavin, and also thank you very much, Kate, for all your support. You both guys are great. I'm gonna say something with Alexa, sorry. Sorry, the music was very high. And también quiero agradecer a mi colega y amiga, la doctora Catherine Messina, del Centro de Investigación y Desarrollo Económico, CIDE, por aceptar participar como moderadora en la sesión de hoy. Muchas gracias, Catherine. I also want to thank my colleague and friend, Catherine Messina, from CIDE, for agreeing to participate as moderator in today's session. Thank you very much, Catherine. Del mismo modo, quiero dar las gracias a otro querido colega y amigo, el doctor Simón Granovsky-Larsen, académico de la Universidad de Regina en Saskatchewan, quien participará en esta ocasión como comentarista al final de las exposiciones. At the same time, I want to thank another dear colleague and friend, Dr. Simon Granovsky-Larsen, an academic at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, who will participate this time as a commentator at the end of the presentation. Les recuerdo que cada exposición será de 20 minutos. Después tomará la palabra el doctor Larsen y al final daremos espacio para preguntas y respuestas de nuestros panelistas y el público que nos sigue en YouTube y también de nuestros colegas del propio seminario en la plataforma. I remind you that each presentation will be 20 minutes. Then Dr. Larsen will speak, and at the end, we will give space for questions and answers from our panelists and the public that follow us on YouTube and on the Zoom platform for our colleagues from the seminar itself. Antes de cederle la palabra a la doctora Catherine, les recuerdo que este seminario organiza las presentaciones en estricto orden alfabético. Before giving the floor to Dr. Catherine, I remind you that this seminar organizes the presentations in strict alphabetical order. Well, without anything else to add, I give the floor to Catherine to start this session. Please go ahead, Catherine.
Muchas gracias, Oliver. Thank you very much. On the contrary, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm sure we will have some great presentations. I'm glad to moderate the session. So we'll begin with a ponencia titulada Place, Power, and the Politics of Governance, Feminism in Canada and Mexico. This presentation will be a three-party. We have three presentators for this presentation, so I will introduce them to you. We have Doctora Alexandra Dobrowolsky, es profesora de Ciencias Políticas en St. Mary's University en Nova Scotia. Enseña en las áreas de estudios de Canadá, estudios comparados en mujeres, género y política. Ha publicado en diversas revistas nacionales e internacionales y es colaboradora y coeditora del primer número especial del Canadian Journal of Political Science on Finding Feminism. She is also the author of many books, 6 books, including Women and Public Policy in Canada, Neoliberalism and After, and her latest collection, co-edited with Fiona MacDonald, Turbulent Times, Transformational Possibilities, Gender and Politics Today and Tomorrow. We also have the opportunity to hear Dr. Tammy Findlay. Dr. Tammy Findlay is a professor and chair in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Her research focuses on feminist intersectionality and social policy, childcare policy, women's representation, and democratic governance. She is the author of the book Democratic Administration, Gender, Governance, and Democracy in Ontario, and co-author of Women, Politics, and Public Policy, The Political Struggles of Canadian Women. Es investigadora asociada en el Centro Canadiense de Políticas Alternativas en Nueva Escocia y expresidenta del Instituto Canadiense de Investigación para el Avance de la Mujer. También contamos con la presencia y la participación de la doctora Hepzibah Muñoz Martínez, que es profesora asociada de Ciencias Políticas en la University of New Brunswick. Sus áreas de investigación incluyen la economía política de las finanzas y la violencia en México, el impacto de la minería canadiense en las mujeres de México y la política urbana, tanto en Canadá como en México. Her most recent publication, her book Uneven Landscapes of Violence, Geographies of Law and Accumulation in Mexico, Between the Washington, Post-Washington, and Wall Street Consensus in the COVID Era, The Mexican Case, and Studies in Political Economy, and forthcoming co-edited book with Cecilia Costero, Minería y Mujeres en Resistencia, Poder, Movilizaciones Sociales y Alternativas de Estudio. Entonces, muchísimas gracias por su participación. Yo les iré avisando cuando nos quedan 5 minutos para la presentación y de nuevo al último minuto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Catherine, and thank you, Oliver, for inviting us to the seminar. So our presentation today draws on a just published chapter written by Tammy and I, as well as a paper that Hepzibah, Tammy, and I will be presenting at the end of May for the Canadian Political Science Association conference to be held at York University. Our topic is feminist governance. So to begin, what is feminist governance? And we have another slide on that. So since the 70s, feminists inside and outside of states have worked to institutionalize a range of feminist ideas and practices in relation to forms of consultation, political institutions, institutional design, international agreements, gender quotas, gender mainstreaming, gender-based analysis, GBA, gender-based analysis plus, GBA plus, gender budgeting. And recently we see new commitments to diversity and intersectionality as part of policy development and policy evaluation. And indeed, policy areas and cabinet portfolios that were once considered soft, to which women were assigned, have expanded to include the hard topics historically dominated by men, like trade and foreign policy. So more specifically, the chapter Tammy and I wrote contributes to the book that was pictured on this previous slide, the Handbook on Feminist Governance. And we argued that Mexico developed a participatory feminist governance model with clear transformative governance ambitions, whereas Canada transitioned from a period of robust bureaucratic feminist governance with elements of participatory governance in the 1970s and early 1980s to a period of retrenchment and then to revocation, especially from 2006 to 2015. From 2015 on, a seemingly transformative turn in feminist governance has instead manifested in what is being called in the literature governance feminism. So to explain governance feminism, basically foregrounds equality, diversity, and inclusion in words, but in deeds, it instrumentalizes and or institutionalizes neoliberal, individualized, marketized priorities. The focus is on efficiency and economic progress. So the chapter with Tammy and I, we looked at prevailing governance feminist mandates and mechanisms which are often strategically deployed and lack social justice outcomes. And these have contributed to feminist mirages, particularly for marginalized women. In our current work with Hepzibah, we're exploring the particularities and specificities of governance feminism. So if you look at the literature on governance feminism, it typically is institutionalist or feminist institutionalist or draws on Foucauldian perspectives. And there are essential aspects that are missing. So more differentiated contextual political economies, historical juncture of capitalism, ongoing coloniality, and a discussion of structure versus agency. So these are some of the gaps that we're seeking to fill with our present research. And Tammy will illustrate some of the foregoing points with examples from Canada, drawing from our published chapter, and Hepzibah will compare and contrast Canada with Mexico, drawing from our new work.
Great, thanks, Alexandra. So in the paper, we trace several periods of feminist governance. So we first look at Canada in the period of the 1970s and 80s, really beginning with the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1970, where the contours of the so-called women's state are drawn at the federal and provincial and territorial scales. So what emerges is both bureaucratic and participatory elements, including networks of ministers responsible for the status of women, creation of women's policy directorates and advisory councils, and then also the introduction of funding for women's organizations and grassroots activism with varying levels of procedural and substantive representation, some coming closer than others to a substantive model. During this period, there's also extensive women's mobilization, successfully entrenched equality in two sections of Canada's 1982 Constitution and the new Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the effectively scuttled two constitutional amendment processes that some fear jeopardized women's rights. By the 1980s into the 2000s, neoliberal governance intersects with feminist governance. And so Brody and Bacher talk about this period as relating to the 3 Ds of degendering policy capacity: the delegitimization of women's voices in public policy, the dismantling of women's policy machinery, and finally, the disappearance of a gender-based lens in policymaking. So under the Chrétien liberals, we see, for instance, the dismantling of the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, the favoring of technocratic solutions in the form of gender-based analysis and gender-based analysis plus, and the systematic application of gender and or intersectional lenses to policy making. So overall, there's a reduction in feminist governance capacity and a reorientation away from feminist advocacy in the policy process. Under the Harper conservatives, we see intensified neoliberalism conjoined with social conservatism. This leads to drastic cuts, including to the Office of the Status of Women of Canada, as it was called then. Its regional offices were closed, equality was removed from its mandate, and its critical research is buried. Gender-based analysis is left to atrophy, and equality-deserving groups were denied and denigrated. Then 2015 arrives, and there are kind of new hopes that there are possibilities for transformative feminist governance. In the 2015 Liberal election mantra, the language supported feminism, diversity, and indigeneity. There are a few examples to indicate reasons for some optimism. The inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was finally initiated. There was gender parity in the cabinet, a new feminist international assistance policy, creation of the LGBTQ secretariat, and the spotlighting of GBA Plus on 2 federal budgets. Status of Women Canada also received more support, was renamed Women and Gender Equality and upgraded to a full department with a larger mandate. And overall, there was renewed support for bureaucratic and to some extent participatory feminist models with new funding opportunities and a greater role for women's organizations. But in the paper, we argue that despite the optimism, we really see more mirages. There have been many critiques of Trudeau's fake or Facebook, or at least neoliberal brand of feminism. There's been an appropriation of progressive language and concepts borrowed from intersectionality, but mainly focused on privileged women's concerns. And talk of Indigenous rights and reconciliation that's at odds with the foot dragging around implementing the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry's recommendations and the structural changes needed around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the remaining state-sanctioned sex discrimination against Indigenous women. We spend some time talking about the role that GBA and GBA Plus play in this new kind of move toward governance feminism. And so we look at how GBA tends to treat inequality as a technical issue that can be solved with simply better information and expertise. We look at the limited training, which is primarily provided online, and it's not mandatory in all departments in the public service. The analysis is often superficial, and the plus rarely goes beyond an additive approach. There are questions about the applicability of GBA Plus to Indigenous women and to colonialism. And there's a rapid corporatization of GBA and GBA Plus consulting and education. So we see both an inclusion and exclusion of diverse women's concerns simultaneously, supplanting the women's state, as well as reducing input from organized and autonomous women's movements and devaluing their knowledge. We see other indications of governance feminism. One is the new department WAGE has a telling acronym that evokes employability and econocentric concerns. It remains quite marginal with limited financial and human resources to conduct substantive policy analysis. In terms of the bureaucratic innovations, they've tended to be quite transitory. The LGBTQ Secretariat was originally aligned to a central agency, the Privy Council Office, but was soon demoted to a line department, Canadian Heritage, which has less research and profile. From a policy perspective, they're largely reactive approaches, appealing to an individualistic equality of opportunity logic that dovetails with neoliberal goals of efficiency, effectiveness, and economic progress, rather than a response to intersectional power dynamics. So governance feminism, we argue, is really a mirage that creates the illusion of inclusion rather than transformational change. We then go on to use 2 examples to look at this from a more regional perspective. And so we look at both trade and foreign policy. And so in terms of trade, we kind of provide the context that the new NAFTA is negotiated amidst Trump's racist disparagement of Mexicans, his macho dismissal of Trudeau as, quote, meek and mild and very dishonest and weak, and of then Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, who, according to Trump, we were very unhappy with, the negotiating style of Canada. We don't like their representative very much. So the Canadian government acknowledged that trade affects women and men differently, which was important, and represented potential for imagining what a feminist NAFTA could, would, or should look like. And Mexico eventually became an important ally of Canada's position against pressure from the US to drop the gender lens. At the same time, there was pushback from both Mexico and the US on moving beyond a gender binary to include sexuality and gender identity. And the Trump administration resisted the very principle of feminist trade. So in the end, we agree with the quotation from MacDonald and Ibrahim that despite some limited language recognizing the importance of gender equality, there is no gender chapter, and the agreement, as they note, merely entrenches a dominant trade model that growing numbers of experts, civil society, and social movement actors want to see rebuilt from the ground up. And so we think about the question of whether we're seeing transformative trade governance. We note that NAFTA does make some improvements to labor protections related to workplace discrimination, equal pay, health and safety, caregiving, and workplace violence and harassment, and that the renegotiation did carve out room for equality-deserving groups across the continent to engage in a reimagining of gender trade regimes. And civil society mobilization really did allow for the envisioning of what transformative trade governance would look like, including meaningful consultation with experts and the public, gender mainstreaming, particularly pertaining to public services, intellectual property, access to medicines, agriculture, environmental protection and labor rights, and applying an intersectional gender analysis that considers the complex, multi-dimensional and context-specific nature of an agreement's gendered impacts, both before and after implementation.
So another example, especially when making the contrast between Mexico, or the comparison between Mexico and Canada, it's in relation to feminist foreign policy. So in 2017, the Canadian government started what it's called the Feminist International Aid Policy, or FIAP. There were 6 main action areas, but one of the core areas is gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, which is considered to be key to more prosperous and sustainable societies abroad. So gender equality here again becomes a tool to deal with economic problems and violence elsewhere, but not in Canada. As Morton et al. Mentions, that FIAP reflects a form of economic instrumentalism, gender essentialism, and paternalism, which is a form of feminist neoliberalism that it's not likely to meet the needs of marginalized and stigmatized women. And so we have that a lot of countries, including Mexico, are applying a feminist lens, but to all of their foreign policy. And for Canada, it's only limited to international aid, leaving other foreign interventions unexamined. And for instance, we know that mining is a big case. It's a big example of this inconsistency. So in contrast, we have Mexico has also a feminist international assistance policy starting in 2020 that applies both internationally and domestically. We also have in Mexico in general, not only in relation to foreign policy, but in general that there is a gender lens, for instance, on violence. We know that the term of feminicide, for instance, addresses issues of systemic violence against women or people that do not conform the norm masculinity. We also know that here I guess the gender lens of violence or gender equality is not only seen as a technical tool, but rather as something that has to be seen in the larger context of colonialism, racism, and class inequalities. For example, there's a focus on migrant women and immigrant Mexican women in the United States. So when we look at distinctions between governance feminisms in both countries, for instance, in Canada, we see that Canada talks the talk of equality and intersectionality, but there's a bigger focus on individualized and rights-based and market-oriented governance feminism. Groups that are consulted have become more professionalized, more expert-based, and more out of touch with the grassroots level. And we see that Indigenous women continue to be marginalized in this type of governance feminism. In Mexico, there's also the issue of gender equality from the point of view of individualized rights, but there's also a connection with social justice, as a social justice lens and more attuned to some feminist groups. Unlike Canada, some national differences are more acute in Mexico than in Canada in relation to governance feminism. Also, another thing that we see in Mexico is grassroots movements are employing this official governance feminism language in order to have their voices heard and have their issues of transformational change inserted in the agenda. And like in Canada and Mexico, Indigenous women continue to be marginalized in this type of governance feminism in Mexico. So
a quick reminder, there's 3 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, more than enough. Yeah. So what we looked at, for instance, when doing the review of what governance feminism, or the way in which governance feminism has been studied in Mexico, is usually seen as the institutionalization of feminism, gender and public policy, or institutionalist analysis of gender policies. We also, one of the interesting things that is coming out in our comparative studies, for instance, that like in Canada, you have that the policies against discrimination, harassment, and violence against women, as well as the Instituto Nacional de las Mujeres, emerge in the context of the dismantling of collective rights and deepening of neoliberalism. Another interesting comparison that we're finding is that many feminist activists and researchers influencing feminist governance have political trajectories tied to the Communist Party or grassroots leftist movements in Mexico. That perhaps tells us a lot about the connection between feminism, gender policies, and in connection with more social justice goals. So some of the ongoing questions that we have is, how does the emergence of feminist governance in the context of neoliberalism influence feminist policy outcomes? In what ways has transformative feminism been limited by this context? And in what ways have activists, members of NGOs and grassroots movements, as well as more radical government officials, have used these official feminist institutions, discourses, policies to advance more transformative goals? So digging deeper into this topic, we're hoping to, what we're doing is exploring how and why governance feminism is not a single thing, but it contains more heterogeneous elements and is always differentiated. And we want to go beyond institutional accounts of feminist governance or Foucauldian approaches to governance feminism to build more on feminist political economy and feminist intersectional approaches. And to conclude and to be continued, the examples that we provided illustrate the messiness of feminist governance and governance feminism as a multi-layered feminist acts and omissions, as well as significant distinctions between Mexico and Canada. And we want to continue studying how and why multi-level governance, including indigenous governance and diverse women's and feminist movements, have worked together and apart, contributing to what are often quite convoluted and contested feminist governance mechanisms in both countries. We see that Mexico has a sophisticated institutionalized feminist governance measures that might exceed the measures found in Canada, but again, gains in Mexico cannot be assumed because the shifting institutional landscape and substantial differences between women in both countries. And in Canada, the distinction between different forms of governance, feminist, whether bureaucratic, transformational, participatory, and governance feminism is blurry and in flux. And also it's interesting to see, compare and contrast Mexico's and Canada's states' capacities and incapacities, especially related to violence, and looking at the different the differences between women's and women's movements in both countries. So gracias a todos por participar en el seminario. Espero que haya estado a tiempo.
Muy disciplinados, muchas gracias. Y muy interesante. Very good. So we have now a second paper that will present Dr. Kate Erving. The title of this presentation is Deterring Climate Change Mitigation, PETRO-POLITICS and Carbon Offsetting in Canada. So let me introduce Dr. Erving. Es profesora adjunta de Estudios de Desarrollo Global en St. Mary University y profesora asociada en la Escuela de Medio Ambiente de la misma universidad. Su investigación se especializa en gobernanza ambiental global, la economía política de la mitigación del cambio climático, los mercados de carbono y la compensación de carbono, financiación del carbono y justicia climática y transformación democrática. She is the author of Carbon, published with Polity Press in 2018, numerous journal articles and book chapters, and the co-edited book with Gavin Friedel, Beyond Free Trade, Alternative Approaches to Trade, Politics, and Power, published with Margaret Macmillan. In 2022, she co-produced and released a short documentary, The Carbon Cage, with Scientific American, while her current book project with Polity Press examines the everyday politics of global environmental problems. She appears frequently in national and international media outlets to discuss her research, works in Nova Scotia with the Affordable Energy Coalition to address issues of energy poverty and energy and green policies at the provincial level, and is a full member of Carbon Market Watch, a Brussels-based not-for-profit watchdog and think tank that works on national and global carbon pricing and climate policy. Entonces, le voy a dar la palabra a la doctora Erving. De la misma manera, le voy a avisar cuando quedan 5 minutos y luego al minuto. Muchas gracias.
Y muchas gracias también. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen.
Solamente antes de empezar, también aprovecho para recordar a los participantes, a los que nos escuchan en línea, que pueden mandarnos preguntas y les responderemos al final. Gracias.
Okay, so thanks very much to the organizers for the invitation and for everyone who has shown up today. I'm really pleased to be able to present to the group. So the title of my talk today, as you can see, is Deterring Climate Change Mitigation, PETRO-POLITICS and Carbon Offsetting in Canada. And so I'm not presenting a paper per se. When I was invited to participate in today's event, I thought I would use it as an opportunity to kind of redirect some of my research. So for about almost 15 years now, I've been conducting research on the political economy of climate governance globally, looking at the evolution of carbon trading and carbon markets and carbon offsetting as neoliberal governance strategies. And a lot of my work has focused on carbon offsetting in the global south in particular, under the Kyoto Protocol. And prior to this particular research, I actually conducted research in Chiapas, Mexico for my PhD, looking at biodiversity conservation and neoliberal conservation policy. So my focus hasn't been on Canada per se in terms of carbon offsetting, but I thought this was a good opportunity to kind of think about some of the really pertinent questions that are emerging within research on carbon offsetting, which then also has significant implications for our ability to actually deal effectively with climate breakdown, which we are seeing in the here and now. It's not a future problem, but a present one, which is continuing to intensify. So before jumping into the specific research questions and issues that I'm looking at, I thought it would be useful to look at greenhouse gas emissions in Canada so that we can kind of contextualize the landscape of carbon offsetting in Canada. and to think about where that fits in. And so this past April, the Government of Canada released or submitted its National Inventory Report on Emissions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in that report, they provided data. So we can see here from 1990 to 2021. And I think the important, oops, sorry, I've got multiple things going on here. The important information here is the top line, which is greenhouse gas emissions, which basically show that from 1990 to 2021, we have seen an actual overall increase in emissions in Canada. And so in 1990, it was 589 megatons or million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And by 2021, we were at 670 tons. And so why 1990 is important is that is the base year that was set out under the Kyoto Protocol to lower global emissions. And 1990, basically wealthier countries, advanced industrial countries, had commitments under the Kyoto Protocol that they were to lower their emissions on average 5.2% below 1990 levels. And so instead in Canada, what we have seen is an overall increase in our emissions above 1990 levels. So that's pretty significant just in terms of the commitments that have been made and our failure to actually meet them. And so digging a little bit deeper in terms of sectoral emissions in Canada, this is measuring 2005 to 2021. What we see is that the oil and gas sector in particular, and this is hence the focus on PETRO-POLITICS in Canada, the oil and gas sector has seen their emissions consistently going up. And obviously 2020, because of COVID, there was a decline, but now we're seeing them go up again. And indeed, it's the only sector that has actually seen emissions increase since 2005. So again, that's another important thing in terms of thinking of the national context in Canada and the fact that it is really the oil and gas sector that's driving emissions increases. And yet we know that in order to deal effectively with climate breakdown, we need to actually tackle oil and gas emissions. There's no question about it, as the primary source of CO2 emissions globally and in Canada. And then just finally here, we've got emissions by province. And so for people who study Canada, it doesn't come as a surprise that Alberta is the top emitter. Particularly, we know that its oil and gas sector is driving those emissions increases in Canada, and then also at a provincial level. And again, that small downward blip we see there, a lot of it can be attributed to COVID and there were lower prices, but we now see a much higher price for oil and gas for various reasons, including the war in Ukraine currently. So Alberta is necessarily a central focus of anyone studying oil and gas emissions and the need to lower them. Just for context, Ontario their emissions, which have been consistently going down, and that is attributable predominantly to the phasing out of coal-fired power. Their number one source of emissions in Ontario is actually transportation, followed by buildings and industrial emissions, whereas in Alberta, it's the oil and gas sector. And so I think, and this kind of connects to the research that I've been doing, over many years now, really kind of looking at these questions of global carbon governance and really trying to kind of problematize, who's doing what, who is responsible for what historically, and how we contextualize those countries, particularly in the global north, that bear a much greater historical responsibility for emissions over time. What is it that they're doing, and what more needs to be done? And then how do we make sense of where we need to go? So in the global context, again, going back to the Kyoto Protocol, which is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it had its first implementation period from 2008 to 2012. Annex 1 countries, which are the industrial northern countries, they had these emission reduction commitments of 5.2% below 1990 levels. And again, Canada was at 589 megatons in 1990, and 2021, 670. Now, under the Paris Agreement, our nationally determined contribution, which sets out our target and what we're willing to do, which is a voluntary target, so not legally binding. We have a commitment of lowering emissions 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. And yet we know that we are woefully inadequate in terms of getting close to meeting that target, because 2030 is not far off at this point. And so in 2021, we were 8.4% below 2005. And most of that, again, is due to coal phase outs. And so we really need to deal with oil and gas. And if we're to think, and this is just a really small snapshot, but per capita emissions around the globe, and this is trying to take a bit of a climate justice lens to it. So Canada has very high emissions, and we know that on a per capita basis, our emissions are 17.5 tons of CO2 per person annually. Mexico's 3.6. India 1.8 and Uganda 0.1. So there's important questions around whose responsibility to lower emissions, particularly when Canada has much greater capacity. So and this ties into this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Historically, Canada has, been contributing to the problem of climate breakdown for much, much longer than many countries around the world. And there's no question that there's many countries where, basic access to electricity is still an issue. In Canada, it's not to say there aren't particular issues, but the financial capacity to actually deal with the issue is much, much greater. So we have a responsibility to act now, and to act aggressively to lower emissions. And the International Energy Agency, International Institute for Sustainable Development, and many others have highlighted that, there can be no new fossil fuel projects if we have any hope of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. And so these two charts I've got here, one just shows that if we think about carbon budgets and how much space we have for emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at this point, a really important paper that came out looking at the phase out of fossil fuels and pathways that could be taken. If we're to have a 50% chance of keeping emissions below 1.5, then we've got about 9.8 years at current emissions before we'll blow through the remaining carbon budget. And that's only a 50% chance. So clearly much more needs to be done. And we also need to contextualize, again, the positioning of various countries, because we can see here, for example, in Canada, we are number 4 globally in terms of fossil fuel, our share of oil and gas production globally. So we are a major player. The United States is number 1. And we 5.4% is our contribution to global oil and gas production. But what we can see as well is that its share of our national GDP is 6.4%. And what this highlights, say, relative to a Trinidad and Tobago, where you've got 40% of their GDP comes from oil and gas, or Iraq, 65%, and many other nations, is that Canada has a much more diversified economy in terms of while there's an outsized politics of oil and gas, particularly around Alberta, we've got much more capacity to actually shift out without it being a major shock to the economy. Whereas in many other countries around the world, we're talking about social, economic, and political shocks should they be required to transition right away. So this is all just to contextualize that Canada has a much greater responsibility to act now and act aggressively, and we have the capacity to do so. And so this is where carbon offsetting comes in. And so this is just a really quick, and I'm happy to answer questions about it, but Carbon offsetting is basically, this is the image I've got here is how it tends to be represented. This idea that, emitters can emit carbon dioxide through production processes, through whatever it might be, through oil and gas extraction. But if there's projects on the flip side, planting trees, not cutting down trees, renewable energy, those projects, once you quantify the avoided emissions from those projects, you can then convert them into carbon offsets worth 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent each, which can be sold to the polluters. So the idea is that you pollute and then you buy carbon offsets to kind of neutralize and cancel out your emissions. However, it tends to get represented as actual emission reductions, and this is the discursive framing of it. But it doesn't do that, because what we can even see in the diagram is it simply cancels out the emissions of another. Now, there's plenty of research, a lot of it, that I've done myself and many others doing it, that really calls into question the environmental integrity of offsets themselves. So we can't actually assume that it's effectively canceling out emissions. I'm not looking so much at that today as opposed to the kind of productive aspects of offsetting in terms of delaying action. So it's not reducing emissions though, but we get a sense that it is. And so when polluters buy offsets, they can claim that they actually reduce their emissions at the source. So if you have an oil and gas producer in Alberta and they buy carbon offsets, they can then say, we actually lowered our emissions, and they can put it on the books and it counts as our emission reductions, which can then be counted towards our commitments under the Paris Agreement or at the provincial level and in terms of federal regulations. So this is contributing to a really profound political economy and politics of delay. Rather than taking action at the source for what needs to happen, we're really avoiding and delaying. And so this is just kind of looking quickly at the Canadian and Alberta context. Crude bitumen and crude oil production from Canada's tar sands has increased 215% since 2005, which makes the oil and gas sector the only sector in which emissions continue to increase in Canada. So this is where we really need to target action. And so, but what we start to see are there's these massive contradictions. So Alberta, as with Canada and jurisdictions all around the world, and we're seeing companies all around the world, has basically said we're going to be net zero by 2050. And I always, say in my work, net zero is not zero. So we have to interrogate, what does this, net actually mean? And so the recently released Alberta Emissions Reduction and Energy Development Plan lays out what is meant by this. And the current Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, noted in the foreword to that document, she says, this is an Alberta-made plan built with our expertise, our unique emissions profile, and our economic circumstances at heart. Instead of moving away from hydrocarbons, we will use these resources in innovative ways to ensure Alberta continues to provide the world with sustainably produced energy and products. Our approach to reducing emissions is based on reality instead of unachievable targets set to random timelines. So it's dispensing with the science of climate change, even though we know it's very solid, and basically saying we don't have any plan to move away from oil and gas production. And in fact, we're going to ramp it up. We're going to continue. So how do you then square the net zero by 2050 with we're going to continue and increase oil and gas production? And basically that's where things like carbon offsetting actually come in, because you can continue to emit and engage in carbon intensive activities, but then you can buy carbon offsets and then say, look, we lowered our emissions. And so there's a really dangerous politics of delay going on here. And so at the regulatory level, Alberta has, an emissions trading scheme and its emissions offset system with lots of protocols and selling offsets to emitters in the province. And just very quickly, another example, and a lot of this finance is going into the oil and gas sector, is to look at, say, banking in Canada. And so the recent Banking on Climate Chaos report that was published about a month or 2 months ago showed that, for example, the Royal Bank of Canada is now the largest financier of fossil fuels globally and oil and gas production at 42.1 billion last year. And so
there's 3 minutes left. Thank
perfect. You. And so what we see there is that, you know, the bank itself has claimed that it's been carbon neutral in its operations since 2017. And what it does is it sets a net zero target for lending by 2050, and it's heavily, heavily involved in purchasing carbon offsets once again. And so we can actually look at all of these different actors and sectors to think about what's actually going on. And so I think what we want to be doing, and what I've been doing with my research, but thinking about the Canadian context, is theorizing carbon offsetting. And there's a number of ways we can do it. One is to, you know, we've got these different analytical focal points that have to do with the process of offsetting and the projects, which I'm not really talking about today per se, but calls into question environmental integrity, things like land rights and human rights, especially around land in the global south, forestry offsetting, indigenous rights. But then in terms of the political economy of carbon offsetting and mitigation deterrence. And so different scholars are now talking about this defensive spatiotemporal fix, where emissions reductions are being delayed and deferred in time and space, so that emitters are not lowering their emissions at the source, but rather it's a future promise or onto other actors, whether it's in the global south or offset projects. And so we've got these displacements that are happening, and mitigation deterrence is basically being defined as the prospect of reduced or delayed emission reductions resulting from the introduction or consideration of another climate intervention. So what I'm looking at is how offsetting is basically deterring aggressive action in terms of lowering emissions, particularly in the oil and gas sector. And now I've looked at this globally and in terms of countries in the global north before. But the argument is that we need much more empirically grounded research to demonstrate the material production of mitigation deterrence, and that accounts for the constellation of actors and interests that shape and influence an emergent and evolving regime of delay. So, you know, with this talk today, I'm going to move forward in terms of that research on the Canadian context and connect it to the global. And so with that, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muy disciplinados todos el día de hoy. Entonces, vamos a seguir con la tercera presentación, una presentación titulada Trade Fetishism and the Trade Justice Ratchet Between Token and Substantive Change in NAFTA 2.0. This talk is the result of the investigation of Gavin Friedel. Gavin Friedel es académico investigador en St. Mary's University, en la cual funge también como director del programa en desarrollo global. Su investigación se centra en el comercio justo y el libre comercio, la política de los acuerdos comerciales, la teoría psicoanalítica y la economía política global. He has published widely on these themes, including the books Coffee and Alternative Trade, Legacies for the Future, as well as the co-edited book, The Fair Trade Handbook, Building a Better World Together, which brings together voices from fair traders, journalists, policy advocates, and academics. He is a member of the advisory board of the Canadian Fair Trade Network and the Trade and Investment Research Project on the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So thank you so much, and I will let you present. And the same thing, I will inform you when we are 5 minutes or 3 minutes away from the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And just quickly, I just want to, well, thanks very much to everybody for the opportunity to present my research, and also a very special thanks to Oliver. It's been a great pleasure having him with us here in Halifax this year. And I know the students as well have gotten a great deal out of his talks and his presentations in my class. And so it's a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to working with you further. Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so thanks very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean today with some of my new work on trade fetishism and the trade justice ratchet. I'm drawing briefly from some examples from NAFTA 2.0. See if I can get my PowerPoint to work. There we go. Which we all know, I think, replaced the old NAFTA in 2020. There are several different names we can use for the agreement. I prefer NAFTA 2.0 right now because it's the one title we can use that doesn't put one country's name first. I think the new NAFTA 2.0 is important in many respects, and this includes the introduction of new labor mechanisms that go beyond any previous trade agreement, a new environment chapter, reductions in the power of investors in the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, and some other changes. And I think the new NAFTA reflects a wider movement in global trade policy in bilateral, regional, and international trade agreements. And what's interesting is after decades of social justice groups pushing for an end to free trade agreements, the pressure instead has given rise to an expanding array of new labor and gender, human and environmental rights components within them. So on the surface, some of this seems to challenge traditional trade approaches, and it seems to also challenge the established debates over free trade versus regulation. And it offers what I would say is an uncertain mixture of token and substantive change. So there's a lot that could be done here with these, not just with the new NAFTA 2.0, but lots of new components in trade agreements, and it is being done. And I think obviously the most important question is how effective are they, or how effective will they be? But within this, there's numerous other important political questions. And for my research today, I'm going to give you a hint of some of the stuff I'm working on. And I'm interested in asking the question, what is it about the popular desire for trade that make it necessary to attain social and environmental goals through trade agreements, as opposed to other multilateral governing bodies? So, you know, I think there's a growing sense among trade justice advocacy groups and unions that this is an important way to give social or environmental commitments some real teeth, is by connecting them to enforced trade agreements. And I think connected to this, I'm interested in the idea that after decades of critique from the left and to some extent from the right, that so much about trade agreements is not about trade, the response has actually been to add more to trade agreements, with some exceptions. So why is this the case? Well, I think speaking in very general terms, trade is very popular. Free trade is very popular, and the idea of trade is very popular. And in fact, it's more popular today generally than it was in the 1990s. And this is interesting. This is despite decades of trade justice groups lobbying against corporate preferences in trade agreements and lobbying against trade agreements in general. They're generally more popular today. And the central importance of this, the widespread popularity of trade, is often analyzed by political scientists and some economists drawing on opinion surveys. And these academics tend to recognize the ways, and here's a quote here, that values and ideology often offer a better explanation of attitudes toward trade liberalization than do economic interests. So I think these opinion surveys and the analysis of them has actually offered us a range of insights. So despite some disenchantment with trade today, it still remains very popular globally. So a fairly recent Ipsos survey of 25 countries found that on average, 75% of those polled agreed expanding trade is a good thing. Free trade and free trade agreements tend to be particularly popular amongst liberals and to some extent progressives. In the US, I'm sure many people, we all know this, it's particularly unpopular these days amongst Republicans in the US. But that varies. In Canada, it tends to be popular amongst conservatives. Free trade tends to be more popular than globalization. Free trade is often, or trade is often seen as the good, the opportunities that come. Globalization is often seen as an imposition, outside interference, threats to national sovereignty. And also of interest is support for trade is full of contradictions and full of complexities. So, for example, polling often suggests that people are highly supportive of free trade, but they're also highly supportive of subsidies and support and protections for domestic industry. So people aren't necessarily thinking along the lines of neoclassical economists when they say they support free trade. And of course, a very common example nowadays to reflect on is the politics of the Trump administration and the fact that Trump supporters tended to be very anti-trade. And, this is despite the fact that in general, on average, they have larger incomes than other political groups, and they tend to not be more trade exposed to threats from global trade. And this has led Rothwell and Diego Rossell to conclude that Trump supporters are heavily influenced by racial identity and cultural attitudes. So while recognizing the importance of values and ideology, I think these works tell us little about where they come from. And in this sense, critical theory, I think Gramscians and Foucauldians are more useful in talking about how these values don't come on thin air, but they come from hegemonic institutions, dominant discourses that shape the acceptable boundaries of trade beliefs. So this leads me to my work on trade fetishism. While a lot of the existing critical works recognize the power embedded in trade discourse, they often see them as detached or imposed by elite hegemony, as opposed to being beliefs that people deeply value, they desire, they even demand them, even if they are also being manipulated by economic and political elites at the same time. So there are certain scholars that have drawn on the idea of trade fantasies. And here they've drawn on psychoanalytic theory to explore trade as a fantasy, one which is deeply linked to human desires and anxieties about existence, and in Lacanian terms, deep feelings of lack that human beings have. Now, particularly instructive here for my work is the idea of fetishism that I'm drawing on Alain Kapoor. And Kapoor points out that under capitalism, we don't just fetishize commodities, but we fetishize popular objects in general. And that basically means, in a very basic sense, we instill them with sublime qualities, magical or symbolic qualities. And we desire them beyond any immediate objective purposes for the emotional and the personal fantasies they offer. And Kapoor talks in particular with fetishism, how this can be applied to various fantasies around disavowal and mastery and foreclosure. So from this perspective, you can explore trade as a fetishized object. Trade agreements, the discussion around them, they reproduce the political economy of trade while simultaneously validating popular shared fantasies. So politicians and trade economists and negotiators, when they negotiate, they represent their nation, or more likely they represent their corporations, but they also serve as symbols of authority that affirm and reproduce dominant trade fantasies. So from this perspective, the material and the symbolic of trade are inseparable. So when you explore trade agreements, the struggle to define what is and is not about trade is perpetual and ongoing. There's no end. And it's not confined to what neoclassical economists or trade experts say it should or shouldn't be. Political economy goals are always cut through with these unconscious fantasies around othering or aggression, racism, colonial superiority, mastery. And the argument here is that they're not side games, but they're central to how we understand trade and its seductive content. Okay, so very briefly now, I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of how I'm applying some of these to the new NAFTA, just with two of my favorite examples from the article I'm working on. So the first example is the disavowal around the negotiations itself. And it was kind of interesting. When the negotiations began, it was widely recognized that neither Canada nor Mexico was interested in renegotiating. The renegotiation was triggered entirely by the US. It was driven by the right-wing populist agenda of Donald Trump. And during the negotiations, as was already mentioned earlier, actually, Trump and his negotiating team were extremely aggressive. At one point during the negotiations, well, they were often looking for opportunities to humiliate their so-called partners. At one point during the negotiation, Trump's top trade advisor, Peter Navarro, said on Fox News that Trudeau deserved a special place in hell for his negotiating position. But despite this, liberal trade experts quickly moved to frame the negotiations about the need to modernize trade for the 21st century. And these were from the same folks that had previously insisted there was no need to renegotiate at all, which I find fascinating. But what I also find interesting is more critical commentators on this issue, I think, were much more sober about the politics that was driving the Trump administration, but they're equally interesting. So Paul Kellogg, for example, recognized Trump's moves as part of a, quote, racially charged move to cement American first policies in a new racist political coalition, says Kellogg. But interestingly, he concludes that Trump's motives as a result were not about trade. Now, the challenges with this, I would say, is that it inadvertently adopts a fetishized version of trade that's not dissimilar to neoclassical economics, narrowing trade to its material objectives. Goals like othering or aggression, they're depicted as diversions from what trade is really about. But as Maureen So has argued, success in trade is often taken to reflect not just material success, but full human status in the global symbolic order. Northern states, rich states will evoke success at trade to uphold their sense of moral superiority. Rising southern economies seek not only to demonstrate their material success, but also their symbolic success, demonstrating the dynamism of their societies and their economies. In this sense, one could argue that trade is very often about race, with trade deployed as a fantasy to demonstrate one's desired superiority. And connected to this, you could argue that one of the main reasons Trump supporters are so unenthusiastic about trade these days is that it has not necessarily proven to produce these outcomes or results. It's failed to prove American superiority. Now, the second example I put up there is more about the temporary breakdown of the foreclosure that emerged during the sudden negotiations. It caught some people off guard, and unions and social justice groups and some politicians moved quickly to take advantage of this gap. So, for example, as was talked about, that they floated the idea of a standalone gender chapter for the trade agreement, which was rejected by the Trump administration. It went against Trump on several fronts. His base appeals to white masculinist identity and perceptions of lost status. His negotiating strategy was heavily masculine, insisting on dominating and blaming trading partners, portraying them as irrational and weak. And the economic vision that the Trump administration had was highly foreclosed in very conventional terms, with no space for issues of social reproduction and feminized labor. What was more successful is the labor components of the new NAFTA, driven in particular by pressure from the US Democrats and by unions. And most notable of this is the rapid response labor mechanism, which of course I can't get into, but it allows the country to request a review and then demand action. And if there isn't action, technically there could be specific penalties on specific companies involved. So far, 8 cases have been brought forward by the US, and the outcomes of them have resulted in protectionist unions in Mexico losing out in favor of new democratically elected unions. So without getting into it, I say the point of it is twofold, or two things that I think are particularly interesting about that. One is that any of these new changes in this kind of political context are immediately met by new efforts to reassert mastery by more powerful partners and foreclose quickly around the opening that emerged. So in this case, for example, this is, I think, very positive, but almost certainly all, if not most of the cases will be against Mexico. Well, there was an interesting one with the US recently. And this stems from uneven power between the participants and the fact that in the agreement itself, those sectors that would be most interesting to Mexico for Mexicans in the US and Canada, construction and agriculture, are excluded from the agreement. So it's inherently uneven. But on a more positive note, I think there's lessons here about the gains that you can attain by not directly confronting the loved object, in this case, trade. Accepting that trade is widely popular, but trade can be about labor rights. So what's the conclusion from this? Well, what's the point of what I'm getting at here? I'd say that I want to point at the politics at play here by recognizing 2 things. So one of them is quoting Kapoor here, the desire to fetishize popular objects in society is very powerful. It cannot be easily subverted, and it frequently chooses people to, quote, choose the fetish despite knowing better. And what that means is that people are so drawn to popular fantasies around economic growth and whatever, even if they understand the critique, they're still drawn towards embracing the fetish. And a second point here by Lucas Pohl is that one may not be able to get over fetishism, but they might be able to get with it. And by this, what Pohl is suggesting is that you recognize the power of fantasy, and instead you push for change in a matter that confronts it sideways, that avoids the direct confrontation. And what I would just point out to conclude here is that this is something big corporations have long recognized. A really good example is the pharmaceutical industry. They've worked for decades to make monopoly protections of intellectual property rights about free trade. And then they've continually ratcheted that up in trade and investment negotiations across the globe, which Dreyhaus calls the global regulatory ratchet. It doesn't matter if we can look at IP rights and say they're not actually about free trade. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't care. They've successfully made it about free trade. And so I think this is something for us to think about when it comes to sustainable trade from a genuinely progressive trade perspective. Can there be a trade justice ratchet? With the rapid response labor mechanism representing an important rung in the ladder. And I think it's a major advocacy point whose full impact is still to be determined in the years ahead. And I think it's useful this way in recognizing the unavoidable connection between the material and the seductive power of trade. And that offers us pathways towards engaging in the perpetual and non-ending struggle around reimagining what is and is not central to the pursuit of trade, making social and environmental justice central to what trade is about, regardless of what a more economistic or conventional approach to trade might say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fredo. It was a pleasure to hear some of your thoughts. So we will continue with the comments of our dear colleague, Simon Granovsky-Larsen. I hope I pronounced it right. So I will first give a couple of minutes to Dr. Granovsky-Larsen to comment on these three really interesting presentations, and then I will share with you the questions from the public and from other colleagues. So go ahead, Dr. Granovsky-Larsen.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you very much to the 5 presenters today, the 3 presentations that were delivered. I found them all absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from each of them. In this position as commentator, you know, we don't have the full papers to read. And so that's probably a good thing for everybody, because there isn't room for the type of anonymous reviewer critical response to the presentations. And really, I didn't find any holes of note in any of the arguments that were presented. So I think I'll just go a quick comment on each one, followed by really a question that rather than sort of poking at the strength of the presentations, which, like I said, I thought were excellent, maybe takes each of them in a slightly expanded different direction to see if the insights that you all have from the research you've been doing might be able to provide a little into these different directions as well. So first of all, the paper by Alexandra, Tammy, and Hepzibah. I really enjoyed this. I think that you've identified a really interesting and important comparison because we have this moment of 2 at least nominally progressive liberal, center-left, socially at least, governments in Canada and Mexico that are also tied through the North American trade infrastructure. So it's interesting to see that in both of these governments, you have somewhat similar attempts to reform governance feminism. But I also noticed that these different attempts or similar attempts are being produced in very different moments of grassroots feminist organizing in the 2 countries as well. I'm in Oaxaca, Mexico right now, and it's the first time I've been in the country in the last 5 years. And really the first thing that stuck out to me, just being present here in Oaxaca, was the visible presence of feminist movements and organizing and popular art and feminist resistance at a street level, but also this governance feminism driven by the state government and the federal AMLO government as well, which has really taken over street corners with billboard presentation of their version of governance feminism. So I think that this sort of moment in comparing is interesting. And the reason I bring up the grassroots organizing is I wonder if if there's anything about the differences in the activist grassroots feminism in the two countries that's also producing the substantial difference in governance feminism that we're seeing in these two governments. You mentioned in the presentation that there seems to be more of a social justice focus and substantive content to the AMLO government's approach to governance feminism. Do you understand that as being a result in any way or affected in any way by what I see as a stronger moment of grassroots feminist organizing in Mexico at the moment as compared to Canada? A second question would be, so despite this somewhat different setup in the two approaches to governance feminism, I didn't hear in the presentation if you see any difference in results. We heard more about the results in Canada. What have the results been of the AMLO government's approach to governance feminism in Mexico? Is there anything about this approach that, at least at a discursive level or at a sort of program design level, it has a stronger focus on social justice and structural change? Is there anything that would go beyond sort of improved language and goals and maybe more genuine consultation and involvement of grassroots actors that would show that there's been more significant results on the social justice and transformative angle or sort of outcome? And if so, what have the mechanisms been in operation that have allowed for Mexico's governance feminism to have a different result? Or if not, then you know, as I guess getting into also what have been maybe possibly similarities in the mechanisms of the two programs, despite differences in discourse and inclusion and the rest. So I leave that a little bit open because I don't have, you know, I'm not coming into this with a preconceived idea of what the results have been. It's a genuine question about what the outcome has been so far and differences between the programs. Moving on to Kate's presentation. I think it was very, very strong and really commendable that you've been able to adapt your focus on the international and global aspects of carbon offsetting and turn it towards the domestic Canadian context. And I think there was a lot of really important observations in your presentation. One thing that I quite liked was the focus on Alberta. I think that it's important to identify, and especially in a quantitative based piece of work like this, to really show the hard numbers that differentiates Alberta from much of the rest of the country, or at least the exaggerated sort of reliance on the oil and gas sectors that Alberta has, and to show that in numbers. It's also interesting, I noticed when you were displaying the contributions of greenhouse gases of various provinces, I think it would also be important to highlight the population difference, the demographics of each province, because of course Ontario shows up as the second highest greenhouse gas producer, but we can also point to not only the presence of a concentration of industry there, but also Ontario being having the largest population. And so there would be a per capita question there that would be interesting to explore as well. On the same note, to look at Saskatchewan and British Columbia, on one of the graphs that you showed, there was a nearly identical amount of greenhouse gas emissions from those two provinces, but British Columbia has something like more than 5 times the population of Saskatchewan. So there's also the politics of oil and gas entrenchment in Saskatchewan that shows up when you start to think about it from a per capita basis. The question that I wanted to put to you, Kate, is taking your research on Canada and connecting it maybe to the research that you've been doing internationally as well, which you did start to make mention of at the end of the presentation. I have to say I've read a lot of your work about carbon offsetting internationally. I've always really appreciated it. And I think there's a lot of room to connect these two as well. I'm interested on the one hand, when you're talking about mitigation deterrence, are there international and transnational aspects of this that you think are worth highlighting as well? Or is this something that mostly takes place within individual domestic contexts, but then has a global consequence? Or are there ways that you could expand on that show how that mitigation deterrence is also taking place across borders in international processes or transnational ones? Related to that, I wonder if within the politics of carbon offsetting in Canada, so now back to the domestic, are there aspects of international carbon offsetting purchase that are affecting the Canadian politics of carbon offsetting? What I mean is, I didn't hear in the paper where carbon offset purchases were located and originating from, the Canadian industry was purchasing for their politics of deterrence and through offsetting. So is that production happening at least partly outside of Canada, and then we have international purchases of carbon credits? And how much of it is, I'd love to hear if you know sort of how much of this is taking place within Canada versus outside of the country. And if you do have this international component to purchase of carbon offsetting, what are the implications both for the producing countries that you have a politics of mitigation deterrence happening in Canada that's relying on production of carbon credits outside of the country? So what are the implications for those locations, but also what are the implications for the politics of carbon offsetting and climate change response within Canada and within Alberta? Does it come up in those conversations? Could it potentially shape the conversations that are happening in the politics around this acceptance of carbon offsetting that's set in Canada? Finally, to Gavin, I was absolutely absorbed in your talk. I really enjoy the direction that you're taking your longstanding research into trade. And the first thought that came to my mind is one that really stuck with me through the whole presentation, which is that, wow, once Gavin has this out there in print, we need to find a way to translate it into first-year language. Because I find exactly what you're describing of trade fetishism, at least, not doing research on this, where I confront it on a most regular basis, is students who come into first-year classes, both students within my international studies program, but also if we have business students and engineering students and a very diverse set of students from around the world, from a number of faculties and disciplines, really bring this trade fetishism with them, I'd say, to a pretty strong degree. And it's where I hear it sort of come out in conversation and discussion in the classroom. I hadn't understood it in the terms that you're presenting it here as a form of fetishism. And so if I can find ways to understand and start to counter and question and challenge this in the classroom now through a framework of trade fetishism, I think that would be a very, very useful tool to have as an instructor. The question that was forming in my mind as I was listening, unfortunately, I think is the same question that you posed at the very end. In your terms, can there be a trade justice ratchet? But I think that the way it was coming together for me is, do you see room for some kind of alternative to trade as such? Or are you hoping and working towards the possibility of trade between national states, including neoliberal and colonial and patriarchal states? Are you working towards a position where those states adapt stronger forms of social justice and trade justice into their trade agendas? Or is this about more than just trade? Are you looking towards a response to trade fetishism where some kind of an alternative to the economic system is hopefully produced that doesn't rely on this type of international trade? I'm really curious to see sort of where the direction of your kind of ideal trajectory out of this goes. The other thing that I think also was coming up in your final slide is, how can we start to dismantle this type of trade fetishism? Does it happen in the negotiating room more than in societal shifts, or is it the other way around? And I wonder, hopefully not phrasing this in some way that I come off in any way supportive of U.S. conservatives and the right in a sort of a Trumpian framework and moment. But I wonder, is there anything to be learned from that, from a recent history in the U.S. where you have a conservative right extremely skeptical of globalization, so-called globalism, global elites, and the international trade agenda? That's been such a substantial shift in a defetishization of trade, or at least a shift in the way that trade's fetishized, not in a direction that I think either of us would agree with, but we still have to recognize that there's been a movement away from that fetishism. So is there anything to be learned from it, lessons that could be then applied to a social justice framework to trade? And I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you again to everyone for these really, really fascinating presentations.
Thank you very much, Simon. So maybe I will give some minutes for to the presentators to comment, to respond to Simon, and then I also have some questions for you from our public on YouTube, and also from some colleagues here in the seminary. So, but first, I want to give you the opportunity to respond. So maybe we can just follow the same order of the presentation. So we would begin with Alexandra, Tammy, and Hepzibah, and then we will follow with we will follow with the other presentations. Pardon.
Can I start with a few, and then Tammy and Hepzibah, is that okay? Just a quick comments. I just wanted to respond to the grassroots point, Simon. Thanks for the amazing points. Like you would have thought you read the papers. You were fantastic. That's so what you got so much out of it from our presentation. So thank you so much. But just in terms of the grassroots, I think you're associating a lot of this change under AMLO, but it's been much more longstanding. So I think in terms of the differences with respect to the grassroots, I think you have to look at the differences in politics locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. So just quickly, in terms of locally, like you're describing, the murals and the protests and the use of art and women's bodies, that's so much more vivid in Mexico in the local level, but it's also more reflective of Latin American feminist mobilization more broadly. So there's that local, regional connection there. Nationally, the fact that feminists were part of the democratization project, so they're kind of like part of the buildup of a state in a certain way. So there's a very different relationship between feminists in and outside the state in Mexico versus Canada, and so the grassroots has a different role given that history. And then internationally, because of all the international, a lot of local feminists leverage the international, using international agreements and international visibility to try to make gains. So the roles of the connection between local and international, the NGOization, the connection of NGOs with the grassroots and the international is also very different from the story in Canada. So I think you're completely right. Like the grassroots has all these different local, national, regional, and international components in Mexico that really give it a different flavor. So these are the things that we're exploring in our paper. I'll pass it on to Tammy and Hepzibah.
Hepzibah, do you want to say something?
No, I agree with Alexandra. I mean, as someone that's, grew up in Mexico and now works in Canada, I mean, it's even, for me, it's even tracing things back to the revolution, like in the, 1910s in Mexico, there were like women at the forefront of the battle. And then you have all these different artistic and social movements, expressions in the post-revolutionary period, in which women were so key in different political, cultural expressions. And here in Canada, it's like you still have like the monarchy, and you know, and you have like the Queen as this, you know, and Victorian society as kind of, and so it's really, so what I found about Alexandra's and Tammy project when they invited me to participate was that they reversed that discourse of Canada superior in everything and Mexico inferior, or global, the Latin America inferior, and then Latin America has to learn from Canada. So I was like, oh, I'm really, so I thought the way they kind of, I mean, without idealizing Mexico and acknowledging that there are all of these issues of sexism and violence, but there was a different take that it hasn't been really heard in comparative analysis for a long time. And also the fact that we are incorporating this, even the connections between the international and the local is like, okay, Canada, you have a FIAP and from feminist foreign policy, but at the same time you are supporting all these mining projects that make lives, the lives of women in Mexico so miserable in so many ways. So it's, so yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add, there's a long story to how Alexandra and I came to be studying this. We're both Canadianists and we're learning about Mexico as we go. And so I love your question, Simon, because I have similar ones. One of the things that I suspect is true in terms of your question about the difference between grassroots feminism is that I think in Canada, there has been not only an embrace of governance feminism by state feminists and institutional feminists, but I think in feminists outside of the state as well. And so even in grassroots organizations, I won't go into examples I've seen firsthand, but I think there are certainly examples where these ideas around governance feminism have really been, have seeped into and have been internalized by grassroots organizations in Canada. And I'm not sure that that's the case in Mexico. I think Hepzibah could probably tell us more about that than I could, but my sense is that that's not the case. It's not nearly the same kind of embrace of these principles on the grassroots level that it is in Canada.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but I think a lot, I agree with that. Like you see, even when you talk to some leaders of movements, of feminist movements, they say, well, yeah, we're using the official language. We don't fully believe, like we say in Mexico, we don't drink the Kool-Aid. But, or in Canada, I don't know where we say it, but that's mentioned. But, you know, we don't believe it, but we're using the language so we can make these changes happen.
Well, thank you so much, Kate, and then Gavin. I don't know if you want to respond something to Simon's comments.
Sure. So thanks, Simon, very much for the questions and the feedback. And yeah, I think the like just little things as well in terms of like the population and per capita are really important, you know, variables to bring into the analysis. And I think there's, you know, from a Canadian context, there's so much difference between provinces, and then there's a lot similar in terms of these evolving regimes, but dealing with different kinds of contexts. So I think there's a lot to look at there. In terms of your particular questions, you know, taking it back to the kind of international research, I mean, I think for me, looking at this question of mitigation deterrence, there's more and more people talking about it. And I think, you know, for many of us, we spent a lot of time for many years, you know, trying to prove the case that offsets and offsetting was extremely problematic on a number of fronts, lacking in environmental integrity, overestimating baselines so that you're actually producing emission reductions that aren't worth anything, carbon colonialism, so offset offsetting and shifting the burden and responsibility onto other actors. And particularly, it's that had been the global north onto actors in the global south. And then we get into issues around land rights and human rights abuses. Really interesting work showing, for example, that all of the net zero commitments that have been made by countries right now, and I think this speaks to the international context, that countries all over the world have been declaring net zero targets for 2050. Some countries, depending on where they're at economically, are saying 2060. But for all of those commitments, their commitments to nature-based offsetting, so tree planting and maintaining forests, would require all of the agricultural land on Earth. And so then we're getting into this trade-off between food or carbon offsets, so that we can maintain business as usual. And so really critical questions there. And I think at the international level, we're really seeing it, and it's still a process that is in motion, but under the Paris Agreement, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the article that deals with carbon offsetting, basically. So carbon trading between countries, and then carbon offsetting in terms of countries being able to meet their commitments to the Paris Agreement by purchasing offsets from other nations. And so it's predominantly countries in the global south that want to be the seller nations, especially those with lots of forests. But that's not entirely the case. So Alberta, for example, they very clearly state. So right now in Canada, if you're complying with provincial regulations in Alberta, for example, or say in Quebec, where they have an emissions trading scheme, you have to buy domestically produced offsets that comply with the regulations. And so we've got federal regulations that are emerging, and then there's provincial regulations. And there's going to be interchange, but right now it's domestic. But Alberta really would like to be able to sell their offsets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. International aviation, rather than lowering emissions, they're looking to have a carbon offset scheme to deal with the growth in aviation emissions. So there's a desire to be able to sell to those schemes as well. And Canada, ultimately, when these Article 6 negotiations are finalized, Canada would like the opportunity or the option to be able to purchase offsets from other jurisdictions outside of Canada as well. So they want to make sure they've got all the flexibility possible to say, look, we lowered our emissions when we in fact didn't. And so very quickly, some of the implications there, a lot of the critics are pointing out that countries in the global south, unlike the Kyoto Protocol under Paris, they are also committing to lowering their emissions. So what does it mean when you sell your emission reductions to the global north, for example? It reduces the space you have to meet your own commitments. And then, and so we're getting into these issues around carbon colonialism and who is ultimately responsible and where does the burden get shifted. So I think there's so much in terms of these interconnections between, even municipalities in Canada are getting into it. Everyone is. And I think pointing out the problems isn't going to make much of a difference because it's seen as a profit-making opportunity. It's seen as, farmers, they want to get into it because they can make money by farming differently. Landowners want to get into it in Canada because they can get money for planting trees or for saying they're not going to cut, their trees. And so everyone's saying in a world of neoliberal governance where we're not getting enough money for this, that, or whatever, how can we now get into the offsetting game to get a new revenue stream? And so I think that even though many of us have been critiquing offsetting for a long time, and there's tons of critiques out there right now, the train is full steam ahead. And so I think this is where we also want to get into mitigation deterrence to really start to tease out how it's delaying or obstructing that action that needs to happen. And it needs to be the Canadas that take much more aggressive action now. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So Gavin, yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, those are wonderful comments, Simon's. There's so much there to think through. I could go on and on. I'm not, of course. I have lots I can say about all of the points you raised there. but I'll try to be very quick instead in my response. You know, that your reflection on the classroom is a really interesting one because, you know, in my case, I agree with you, obviously, with my students, but it's also with trade policy people I've talked to. And when you read more conservative reports on trade as well, it's kind of interesting. It's like, you know, psychoanalytic theory isn't really about digging out some deep unconscious. It's actually about looking what's right in front of you that everybody perpetually disavows. And so, you know, with more progressive trade policy people I've interviewed, they'll say things like, oh, well, you know, free trade, they just bring that out as a hammer to beat me over the head when they want to win a debate. Or, you know, more conservative commentators will always be like, oh, we had all these great trade ideas, and for some reason, the irrationality and the emotions of the negotiations ruined everything. It was so irrational, the final outcome. And so all these trade people see this happening all the time, but somehow it's never actually what trade's about. It's always, trade is about something that we always fail to reach. We're always failing to actually get the true free trade agreement that will be 2 pages long and do nothing but reduce trade barriers. So that's sort of what gets me into this. Now, in terms of the 2 more specific things you mentioned, one of them is kind of interesting with the, you know, the idea of a trade justice ratchet. I think it is inherently kind of reformist to think that way. It's like, how do you get beyond a trade fetishism if you're only going to approach it sideways? So this is something I elaborate more in my article, but it's very difficult because if you accept the fantasy, you're also kind of chaining yourself to what you can get out of it. I think you can push beyond it, but to go beyond it, you have to realize how deeply embedded people can be in these fantasies. And looking at that big data stuff, the surveys is quite fascinating. There's lots of Latin American countries, for example, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, all of them on that survey scored very high, 85 to 87% in favor of expanding trade being a good thing. So these are these very powerful emotional buy-ins people have. And I think there's a tendency sometimes amongst the progressive circles to think you can break that in a very direct, simple way. And then people are just going to say, oh my God, I was wrong. Like, we need an alternative trade. Like, I spent my own career pushing for that. And then yet trade becomes more popular, not less. So I think that, you know, there might be something a bit reformist about the trade justice ratchet, which is difficult to push beyond. If you think about what you were saying about, is there something to learn from the right? And I agree with you, of course, on all the caveats about their racism and sexism and you know, what do we learn from that? I think in a way, the rapid response mechanism did learn something from that, because that door was opened by Trump. But it was opened by Trump in this typical populist way. He didn't care about the outcomes. And then unions in Canada, the US, and Mexico, and also the Democrats in the US said, well, wait a minute, if we're going to do this labor thing, what if we did it properly? And it was actually tacked on as a side agreement at the end to take what was the existing labor chapter and actually make it potentially enforceable. So in a way, they were following that. And what I would say the lesson and the real challenge is that to overcome this sort of fetishism, I think what the right understands is how deeply invested people are in very straight up values. And it requires progressives to come up with a version, an alternative trade that is desirable, that people buy in, not just in a rational CCPA level. I work with the CCPA, but not just at a rational report that someone can write, but also at the level of emotion that people are actually deeply invested in because it excites them. It feels like it's something they want to be involved in. And I think that is something that the right, unfortunately, does understand in a way that sometimes progressive forces don't. And of course, I could say more, but I think I'll say that for now.
Thank you very much. Now we will open the floor if someone wants to ask something to our presentators. But meanwhile, I will just share with you some comments that we received on YouTube. Hay unas felicidades a los expositores del Grupo de Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad del Valle de México y del doctor Ayala. También tenemos una pregunta en el chat de Claudia Lucotti, que le gustaría preguntar a las primeras ponentes si la gobernanza feminista toma en cuenta, aunque sea de manera limitada, paradigmas otros como aquellos emanados de ciertas formas de autogobierno indígena. And on YouTube, we also have Ale Resendis for Kate, who's asking, what are the strategies of the federal government to find a balance between the pollution caused by oil, but which on the other hand allows economic development and generates jobs? Maybe we can begin with these questions. And oh, I see Marcela Lopez Vallejo also in the chat. She asks 3 questions. The questions are for Kate. In your argument of offsets delaying actions, are the third-party verifiers useless to prevent non-additionality or double counting? And the other one, assuming non-additionality, are reforestation long-term offset projects not useful to reduce GHGA? If I'm not saying it right, Marcela, you can open your sound, your mic. And third, the transnational approach of WRI can help to avoid delay, she asks. So if you need more clarity, Kate, Marcela is with us. And then maybe we will open for a second round if we have time. So I think the first question was for Alexandra, Tammy, and Hepzibah. And the second one was for Kate. Oh, and Oliver too for Gavin. Nos pregunta, ¿de qué forma el fetichismo comercial del NAFTA 2.0, como le llamas, ha sido afectado al menos en México con un gobierno que ciertamente es diferente al hacer un lado la retórica que el libre comercio es la solución a todos los problemas del país, como era antes? Es decir, el gobierno mexicano tiene muchos fetiches mediáticos, pero el comercial no parece ser uno de ellos. Entonces, si quieren en este orden, preguntarles. The first question, yeah, I can translate it for you. Claudia Lucotti is asking about the feminist governance that she presented and asking if there are some paradigms, well, some concepts that are inspired by some forms of auto-government, indigenous auto-government, for example. And for Kate, yeah, the question was in English. Okay. Gavin, if you need me to translate it, I can also translate.
I think I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Tammy, did you want to respond in relation to the indigenous government? I mean, there's not a lot of connection to indigeneity with respect to feminist governance. Like, it is sort of seen as a separate thing. So in the sense that, in one sense, it's included in relation to dealing with violence, so dealing with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And you know, the Trudeau government, in words, talks about a government to government relationships. It talks about reconciliation, but in practice, these things they've not been realized. So that's part of the disconnect that we're looking at. So in general, the feminist governance agenda in Canada it's good for some women, but it tends to be for privileged women. So it just doesn't include marginalized women, of which Indigenous women are you know, quite substantial. Not to say that Indigenous women haven't been mobilizing. We wouldn't have had a missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry if it wasn't for Indigenous women mobilizing to show the atrocious numbers of missing and murdered women. And they've been not mobilizing for years. So under the Harper government, they refused to have this inquiry. So it seemed to be a bit of a win to have this inquiry under Trudeau. But then there are all these recommendations that weren't, that haven't been acted upon. And the other interesting part there is that this inquiry basically connected missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls to genocide. And there's a lot of pushback in relation to that. So the report was clear to say this is, you know, an act of genocide on the part of the Canadian state. And there was a lot of, you know, reaction to that. So I would say Indigenous women are changing the discourse, and Canadian politics has had to respond, but it's been very incremental. And even though the Justin Trudeau government talk the talk on some of these issues, they haven't been walking the walk. I don't know if Tammy and Hepzibah want to add to that.
No, I think that was a good answer. I don't have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, in relation to Canada, I agree with Alexandra. I mean, in relation to Mexico, I think there's also, while there is a lot of influence of grassroots movements in gender policy, I know from at least from the Consejo Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas that there are issues that they're still working on, that they have not been consulted, that they continue to be marginalized, even under the AMLO government.
Thank you so much, Kate. There was this question about the federal government, the strategies of the federal government to find a balance between the pollution caused by oil and allowing economic development and generating jobs.
Thanks. Yeah, I think on that particular question, I mean, the federal government has certainly shown in Canada its desire to make sure that, you know, it continues to invest in the oil and gas sector. We have not complied with, you know, commitments that have been made to stop subsidizing fossil fuels domestically. And, you know, we buy pipelines like the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And if we want to get into reconciliation and in Indigenous land rights, you know, we see significant problems around that. And so I think, you know, the government is talking about a just transition and a just transition policy. And it's not that they're not also investing in green projects. We need much more in terms of the ambition to have a fair and just transition. And I would also say that this is where we always run into this problem, because, you know, the economic and political interests and the political economy of these interests means that we continue to buy pipelines. But climate science tells us very clearly that we need to actually stop, you know, investing in fossil fuel infrastructure and the expansion of the fossil fuel sector. And so that tension is there. And I would say the government is choosing the politics rather than saying we are in a much better position globally as a nation to be able to finance a meaningful and more rapid transition. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and I recognize that. And I understand the fear that many have around what does it mean for my livelihood and my job. And that's why you need really meaningful investments in a just transition to make sure that people have other options to go to, or they will fight the transition, obviously. And that is what we're seeing politically in Canada. In terms of the questions from Marcella, is it Marcella? Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the third-party verifiers like Vera and you know, the like Climate Action Reserve and the Gold Standard and all of these other actors, I think that they, you know, and there's a lot of investigative journalism happening right now to show that the certifications that they've been providing and the projects that have been certified are actually super, super problematic, and they're not additional. And that's happening whether it's in California, where the forestry offsets are not additional, or in the United States, or it's in terms of broader, you know, offsetting around the world. And so cook stoves and forestry, there's a lot of that in the media right now. And so I would say that when it comes to these third-party verifiers, I mean, a lot of people are talking about the fact that there's a real conflict of interest there, because they're engaged in project development, or they make a lot of they make their money by verifying the carbon offsets. So they have an incentive to see more and more and more of them. There is not an incentive to scrutinize for integrity. And hence, many would say that, you know, we really have to think critically about the role that they're playing in terms of, you know, trying to advocate for the voluntary markets or compliance markets because of this conflict of interest that they have and all of the problems we've seen. In terms of forestry offsets, while I believe that we need to make sure that we protect our forests and tree planting can be a good thing when done properly and community-based, I think that never Well, I think we shouldn't be carbon offsetting. I think we should be honest and say, you know, if you want to commit to projects that are good projects, that's one thing. But to claim emission reductions, that's entirely different. And this gets into the politics of delay. And forestry offsetting, you know, we're told this myth that forests somehow compensate for extracting fossil fuels out of the ground that right now are there permanently forever. We never have to worry about their carbon entering the atmosphere, and trees will never be able to absorb those new sources of carbon. And on top of it, this permanence question. Forests are not permanent. I mean, I was just reading the other day in Canada, but then we also have the Amazon and places all around the world. The forests are not sequestering carbon anymore, and many are becoming net sources of carbon dioxide. So absolutely not for forestry. It shouldn't be done. And then just in terms of the last point, the transnational approach is at the World Resource Institute. I'm just not clear on that one.
Sorry, the Western Climate Initiative?
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, to that, I think cooperation can be a good thing, but essentially that's cooperation on carbon markets and carbon trading. So I would say that we need different initiatives that aren't about facilitating the trading rather than reduction at the source. And so, you know, while they show that entities and jurisdictions can cooperate, I would say that let's find ways to cooperate without it being about offsetting and carbon trading.
Thank you, Kate. And now, Gavin, if you want to answer Oliver's question, and I think then we will go, well, we will have to leave. So I'm giving you some moments to answer Oliver's.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Oliver, that's you know, the short answer is that I think there's a kind of trade populism, and that's distinct from, say, AMLO's version of populism. And I'd say that in a very brief sense, you know, I've read your work and I've engaged with it a bit in both my papers, this one and one that I've published. And I've also engaged at the same time with the literature that Alexandra, Hepzibah, and Tammy are also drawing on a bit about instrumentalizing originally radical discourses that become instrumentalized and simplified. And in your case, your excellent work on populism about, you know, this idea of creating this sort of simple and direct relationship between leader and led that appears to resolve complex answers in a very simple way. And so I think that, you know, merging those in my own, building on them in my paper, I'd say that there's two things that come to my mind. One is that there's a tendency in the trade literature to see these issues as being about populism versus free trade or trade liberalization. And the trade liberalizers like Trudeau always want to stop the growth of populism. But I would say that trade is also a form of political populism. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this trade fetishism, that you can create a very magical world of trade resolving all the world's problems. Now trade is going to solve climate change, trade is going to solve gender inequality, trade is going to deal with indigenous rights, trade is going to promote human rights. I go to these WTO meetings and you think that trade was the answer to all the world's problems. I think that's a kind of liberal populism. And then connected to that, again, directly connected to your work and some of the stuff I've written, is that I think with populism or instrumentalism, the only other difference I would bring to the table with trade fetishism is that it's not just that politicians are manipulating us with populism or with instrumentalism. People desire that. They want populism. They want instrumentalism. They want simple, clear answers to complicated problems. And so in a way, these politicians know how to feed off our weaknesses by giving us something that we want, even if real trade, real populism, real politics is much more complicated. So I would see that as a kind of, there's the AMLO version of populism, and then there's a kind of Trudeau's different version of populism, and his involves feminist international assistance policies and trade trade the way I've described it. Yeah, progressive trade.
Thank you, Gavin. Really interesting. So I think that we will close. There's some questions that we could, well, we could keep on and on with questions about the future of all these subjects. And I think that we had really great insights today, political insights and political critics Really interesting. So I don't know, Oliver, if you want to say some few words before we close the session. And for my part, well, thank you so much. It was really great to hear all of you and to meet all of you.
Muchas gracias por tu colaboración, Catherine. Gracias, Simón. Thank you very much. Gavin, Alexandra, Tammy, Hepzibah, Kate, thank you very much for being today with us. And see you soon, my dear colleagues. Bye-bye. Good afternoon.
Adiós.
Adiós. Cuídense mucho. Bye-bye.
Adiós.